you very much, Giovanni, for this very warm introduction, really heartwarming introduction. And all I can add to it, that it is very easy to make friends with you. So, and that is a title perhaps I'm the most proud of amongst all the ones that you listed before. But I guess it is about time that we got down to business, which means I should share my screen of these slides. I hope everybody can see what I see on my screen, showing the title of this presentation, Faith and Reason, somehow.
Perfect.
Okay, so everybody can see it, I hope.
Yes.
Okay. So to begin this presentation, I have to say that this is not going to be properly a presentation of the topic listed under the title Faith and Reason in Medieval Scholastic Thought. It would rather be a presentation of a presentation, because, or a presentation of possible presentation, because originally I prepared for a full-blown lecture of 1 hour. And I just learned that officially I would have only 15 minutes for this. So I would rather just blow through or zip through these 15 slides that I have in order just to give you a taste of what is to come, of all those juicy bits on this smorgasbord that is going to be this class on the issue of faith and reason in medieval scholasticism. So what is the big issue with faith and reason? And what can we learn about it by dealing with it in the context of medieval scholasticism? In order to give a sensible answer to this question, I start with surveying contemporary attitudes, typical attitudes concerning the issue of faith and reason, ranging from militant atheism on one end to bigoted religiousness on the other. Militant atheism can be summed up with the slogan, reason trumps faith, and I also list some arguments in support of this position, or rather arguments that people and reasons that people who hold this position tend to bring up, such as the argument from evil, the argument from science, or even the Marxist argument, according to which religion is nothing but the opiate of the people. But not to disappoint everybody with just listing these arguments, I also give some brief replies, or rather indications of replies to these arguments. Also on the other end, with bigoted religiousness, which can be summed up in the slogan, faith trumps reason, the main argument would be something like science is the fake news of the godless modern Western intelligentsia, to which the quick reply would be that based on fake news only, you could not really produce working technology such as this online meeting. So this is a little dialectical introduction of these typical attitudes from militant atheism to bigoted religiousness, with also all sorts of varieties of agnosticism in between, which is basically the idea of how would I know which of the two opposing parties of religion and science would win out. In any case, the important lesson from this survey is that what is common in all these contemporary attitudes is that they all presuppose that faith and reason, theology and philosophy, religion and science are radically incompatible. And all these attitudes are in sharp contrast with the one prevailing in scholastic rational theology, characterized by the idea that with the right understanding, faith and reason cannot be in conflict. Rather, they must accord with each other. So this tradition, the tradition of rational theology of medieval scholasticism, is based on what I refer to the principle of the necessary concordance of faith and reason, which claims that reason in its right use must lead to truths from self-evident truths, and faith understood well also must lead to truths from principles revealed by the first truth. But truths cannot be incompatible with each other, so they must accord with each other. Now, this is just a statement of this attitude, which, however, is in radical contrast with all those listed before, based on the fact that the previous attitudes, the typical modern attitudes, are based on this false presumption of the necessary conflict between faith and reason. Now, a corollary of this principle of the necessary concordance of faith and reason is that whenever there is a perceived conflict, it can be explained, that this conflict between faith and reason, it can be explained away by pointing out errors in reasoning or by presenting a more profound interpretation of the principles on either side. It is important that to note that this is a rational enterprise, both on the part of faith and on the part of reason, to check the correctness of our reasoning and to check the correctness and sophistication, let's say, of our interpretations of our first principles, whether on the side of reason or on the side of theology. Now, this is the program of rational theology, most systematically started by Augustine, carried on by Anselm and Aquinas, and made rather complicated by such subtler minds as Scotus and Occam in late scholasticism, eventually leading to the general separation of religious, theological, and secular philosophical scientific discourse, landing us in our contemporary predicaments listed on the first slide. At any rate, this is the line of historical developments I'll sketch out in the remaining time, author by author. Based on the lessons of this story, I'll also suggest some remedies to our contemporary predicaments toward the end. Well, let's see. Let's start with Augustine. To get a good grasp on Augustine's conception of the relationship between faith and reason, which is going to be one of the fundamental themes in medieval philosophy and theology, the first text we should consider in some detail ought to be Augustine's History of Philosophy in chapters 2 to 12 of Book 8 of the City of God. In Augustine's treatment, the history of philosophy up to his time exhibits a steady movement from a merely theoretical, mostly materialistic explanation of natural phenomena to an ever more subtle realization of the nature of the ultimate non-material cause of all these phenomena, a realization that is not merely theoretically important, but one that has vital practical importance with far-reaching implications as to how we should live our lives. So it is moving from materials to spiritual, and from merely theoretical to also practical. Thus, it should come as no surprise that after a brief survey of pre-Socratic philosophy, Augustine praises Socrates for finally bringing moral issues under philosophical scrutiny. But after Socrates, the palm goes to Plato and his followers for establishing the system of the major philosophical disciplines and for launching within that framework a systematic search for the ultimate truth in speculative philosophy and for the ultimate end, the supreme good, in practical philosophy. Therefore, for Augustine, Plato's enterprise amounts to the search for God, namely to find in him the cause of existence, the principle of reason, and the rule of life, since those three things correspond to the three divisions of philosophy: natural, rational, and moral. Natural, taken broadly, including also metaphysics, rational being the science of logic, and moral philosophy is the philosophical study of the guidance of our life. And of course, these three, if you go to the passage, you will see that this trinity of the disciplines will correspond, obviously, to the three persons of the Trinity, the source of all, the Father, the second, the person of the divine word, the Logos, which left its footprint, as it were, on our souls in the form of logic and rationality in general. And the person of the Holy Ghost is somehow the source of the workings, the right workings of the human will, especially expressing itself in love, imitating divine love. So these philosophical disciplines are just diverse pathways to the realization, both in the speculative and in the practical sense of the word, of the same ultimate truth and ultimate end that every human being naturally desires, whether they know it or not, all bearing this vestigium trinitatis, this footprint of the Trinity in their souls that I mentioned earlier. So indeed, Augustine claims that even materialist thinkers, such as the Epicureans or the Stoics, are also after the same ultimate truth and ultimate end. However, because of their sense-bound imagination, they just fail to realize what in fact it was that they were looking for, and thus kept looking in all the wrong places. At this point, toward the end of chapter 5 of book 8, Augustine provides a brief summary of his argument for God's existence he had worked out in more detail in his De Libero Arbitrio. And here I have a link to hand out for detailed treatment of the argument itself, which we have to skip now for want of time. However, quite importantly, Augustine provides this piece of reasoning here not in order to prove the existence of God, which he never seriously calls into doubt anyway. Rather, he invokes that proof in order to show what it was and that the ancient materialists missed in their reasonings that led them astray in their natural philosophy. By contrast, the Platonic philosophers did not miss this point, namely that the visible universe exhibits a natural hierarchy of perfection, on the top of which one finds the human soul, of which we just know that it cannot be material, given that material objects can only exist in the soul in their immaterial images. However, the soul cannot be the source of all material perfection, or even of its own finite and mutable immaterial perfection, whence all these perfections must come from an even superior source, which must ultimately be the immutable, infinite source of all perfection, this God. So this is the gist of the argument in a nutshell. But clearly, the point of this piece of reasoning, whether it works or not, is not to convince atheists. There are too many dubious that it relies on, but rather to show that in the last analysis, this argument points to the exact same truth that is held by the Christian faith, based on the revelation of the scriptures. Indeed, this is precisely why it is perfectly reasonable to hold by faith both those revelations that we can and those that we cannot prove by reason. Excuse me, I'm still recovering from COVID. Okay. For if some alleged revelation is utterly unreasonable, coming from an unreliable source, such as the myths of the poets presenting gods as sometimes even inferior to humans, then it is reasonably rejected as being mere fable or superstition. I'm sorry, I just need to take a sip. But if some revelation is in perfect accordance with reasonable philosophical conclusions, which at the same time show that the source of this revelation must be precisely the source of all truth, then it is perfectly reasonable to accept from it on faith not only what reason can prove, but also what is beyond the capacity of human reason. So there is this idea of the trustworthiness of the source. So if we can reasonably accept the trustworthiness of the source, then we can reasonably accept from that source whatever it reveals to us. Now, in its speculative role, therefore, faith is not contrary, but rather complementary to reason. To be sure, this idea is not entirely original with Augustine. In fact, we can get a hint of it already in Plato's Phaedo, which is really significant that it is even without a Christian revelation or without any sort of systematic reflection on religion as such, Plato already hit on this idea in the Phaedo when Simmias in the Phaedo, before introducing a major objection to Socrates' argument for the immortality of the soul, says the following: I feel myself, and I dare say that you have the same feeling, how hard or rather impossible is the attainment of certainty about questions such as these in the present life. And yet I should deem him a coward who did not prove what is said about them to the uttermost, or whose heart failed him before he had examined them on every side. For he should persevere until he has achieved one of two things. Either he should discover or be taught the truth about them, or if this be impossible, I would have him take the best and most irrefragable of human theories, and let these be the raft upon which he soars through a life, not without risk, as I admit, if he cannot find some word of God which will more surely and safely carry him. Now, this is exactly Augustine's attitude. However, with the enormous difference that he thinks he has already found that word of God that Plato is merely yearning for. And he thinks he can think this quite reasonably, based on the fundamental agreement between the God of Plato and the God of Moses, of the revelation of the Bible. Thus, Augustine is convinced that so much agreement in their teachings cannot be mere coincidence, that they both teach the same, one based on reason, the other based on revelation, shows that the true faith and true reason must agree with each other. Indeed, they must be talking about the same one true God. That is, Plato and Moses somehow converge in their intentions to talk about the same one true God. So what do they have to mean by the word God and its equivalents, Deus, Theos, Dio, etc., to be able to pick out the same intended object of their thoughts? Augustine's answer lays the ground for Anson. People not often realize this, that Anson's famous description of the meaning of the name God as that than which nothing greater can be thought is already present in Augustine's De Doctrina Christiana, on Christian doctrine, in this passage, of which I will read only the first sentence. For when the one supreme God of gods is thought of, even by those who believe that there are other gods, and who call them by that name and worship them as gods, their thought takes the form of an endeavor to reach the conception of a nature than which nothing more excellent or more exalted exists. So this is precisely the idea of the intention of talking and thinking about God as that than which nothing greater can be thought, which is the basis of Anson's famous so-called ontological proof for the existence of God. I just want to run through this little reconstruction of the basic structure of the argument, just to show you why this is such a mind-boggling piece of reasoning that the literature about it does actually fill entire libraries. So here's the first premise. D is just the abbreviation. This little small case letter D is the abbreviation of the long phrase that than which nothing greater can be thought. So God is the This is the nominal definition of the term God. There is nothing controversial about this premise. Now, D is in the understanding. That is, D can be thought of. You can, with the understanding of the description that than which nothing greater can be thought, you're obviously targeting this object with your thought. So D is in the understanding. But let's assume with the fool of the Psalms that God does not exist. That is, D is not in reality. However, here is the further self-evident universal principle. If something is in the understanding and not in reality, then something greater than it can be thought, namely something that is in reality, which does have some real perfection, making it greater than an object of thought that in reality is nothing, so it has no real perfection whatsoever. So if something is in the understanding and not in reality, then something greater than it can be thought. Now we can instantiate this universal conditional for this one individual object of thought, D. If D is in the understanding and D is not in reality, then something greater than D can be thought. It's just a simple logical step of universal instantiation. But then this conditional with the first, with the second and the third premises provides us with the opportunity for perfect modus ponens. We can just detach the conditional, the consequent of the conditional, which says something greater than D can be thought. But D is that than which nothing greater can be thought. So something greater than that than which nothing greater can be thought, which is a contradiction. So this is a perfect reductio ad absurdum. And yet, even Thomas Aquinas, who is obviously not an atheist and is certainly not a denier of God's existence, has some objection to Anselm's argument. Most importantly, to my mind, in his Summa contra Gentiles, in which he makes the following remark. I do not read the entire passage again, just for the sake of time. He says, no inconsistency is involved in the position of those who think that God does not exist, for no inconsistency is involved in being able for any given thing, either in the intellect or in reality, to think something greater, except for those who concede that there is something than which a greater cannot be thought in the nature of things. In this passage, Aquinas explicitly refers to the asymmetry in the positions of the theist and the atheist with respect to Anselm's argument. Those who think of God as that than which nothing greater can be thought of cannot think that he does not exist, save inconsistently. This is exactly what Anselm's argument correctly proves. For those, however, who think that for any thought object the greater is thinkable, no inconsistency arises when they think of what in their view is mistakenly believed by the theists to satisfy this description, which in their view exists only in the theist's intellect. So Anselm's argument can be compelling only for those whose universe of thought objects already contains an thought object than which they think nothing greater is thinkable. That is, someone who is willing to think of something as that than which nothing greater can be thought is obviously committed to the real existence of the existence of this object of thought. So those who are already willing to think of something as that than which nothing greater can be thought of are committed to the real existence of this object of thought. This willingness, however, cannot be forced by Anselm's argument on anyone whose universe of thought objects does not contain such an object of thought. Such a person has to be persuaded first to be willing to think of something as that than which no greater is thinkable, because otherwise they would just think of something as that of which the believer thinks as that than which nothing greater can be thought. But the non-believer would never think of anything as that than which nothing greater can be thought. So they can refer to the believer's object of thought sort of parasitically, simply riding on the conception of the believer, which, however, they don't share and they are not willing to share. So it is this willingness that somehow has to be communicated to them or are made appealing to them by another sort of approach. So this cannot be achieved by simply telling him to think of what the description applies to, as he simply does not think the description applies to anything in his mind, although, of course, he believes that others think it applies to something in their mind. But he just does not share their mentality in general. So here is Aquinas' cosmological approach, trying to remedy this sort of failure of Anselm's argument. So Aquinas thinks one needs what Kant later dubbed a cosmological proof, which in essence is an argument to the effect that based on the commitment to the existence of objects of ordinary experience, one can be shown to be committed to the existence of the universal cause of all these objects, namely God. Now, without going into any details of Aquinas' actual cosmological arguments, let me just, because I guess these are generally known to everybody, although a thorough understanding of them is a further issue. But let's just deal with some typical objections that are usually used against these. This sort of cosmological approach. So this sort of reasoning can be vitiated by two main types of objection. The first, which I will refer to as the self-sufficiency objection, argues that the obvious existence of the phenomenon the cosmological argument refers to does not need an explanation in terms of an efficient cause. It just exists, and there is no need for an efficient cause for its existence. See, for instance, the objections to Aquinas' first way from the Newtonian idea of inertial motion. The second type of objection, which I will refer to as the infinite regress objection, argues that even if the obvious existence of the thing in question does need an efficient cause to sustain it, that cause need not be God, but may be an entity other than God, which in turn can also be caused by something other than God, and so on to infinity, without ever needing a first cause, which one might plausibly identify with God. Now, here are two quick responses to these objections. First, to self-sufficiency. If we can show the real distinction between essence and existence in all entities but one, then this shows the necessary reliance of all on that one for their existence. In fact, this is Aquinas' approach in the De Ante Essentia, which is harder metaphysical approach rather than the sort of Aristotelian scientific approach that he presents us with in the Summa Theologiae and the Five Ways. But unfortunately, physical theories are sort of volatile, and with the passing of Aristotelian physics, the demonstrative force of these scientific or physical type of arguments lose their force. On the other hand, there is this very strong metaphysical argument based on the real distinction between essence and existence, which is not such a self-evident common experience, but at least it is plausibly arguable and is plausibly argued for, as I would maintain in Aquinas' De Ante Essentia on being in essence. And that is why I think we should go back to that particular argument in some detail later. As for the other objection, the infinite regress objection, I would say that an infinite model of the premises and the negation of the conclusion is logically possible. However, such a system is physically impossible, for it presumes the physical possibility of an infinite series of energy transmitters to sustain their ultimate effect without an actual energy source, like an infinite series of electric transformers without a power plant. You think about it, that is not quite possible. Okay, but these are just hints at serious arguments that can be spelled out in precise detail, as we are going to do in the actual class devoted to this topic. Now, let's move on to later developments in rational theology in the scholastic tradition, dealing with Scotus and Occam. So the issues mentioned in the previous slide will be hammered out in painful detail when we get to them in due course. For now, let us see how these later developments led to our contemporary predicaments listed on the first slide. First, we must mention Scotus's reaction to Aquinas' rational theology, which is partly a genuinely sophisticated further articulation of shared principles, partly a genuine deviation in the interpretation of certain basic metaphysical principles dealing with the ontological status of universals, individuation, inherence, the analogy of being, relations, and concerning ontological distinctions, conceptual, real, numerical, and Scotus adds formal. Now, all this was put forward by Scotus in the hopes of a clearer, subtler understanding, not only of natural theology that we have dealt with so far, but especially the mysteries of faith, such as the Trinity of a simple God, the incarnation of the Word, and its real presence in the sacrament of the altar. However, things were getting complicated, which is manifested by Occam's reaction to Scotus. Scotus's realism concerning immanent universals and his theory of formal distinctions apparently introduced the possibility of endless metaphysical debates over weird entities such as where-ness, ubitas, or when-ness, quando-laetas. These are actual existing phrases, and some followers of Scotus. In general, according to Occam, this conception would entail that, and I quote, a column is to the right by to the rightness. God is creating by creation, is good by goodness, just by justice, mighty by might. An accident inheres by inherence. A subject is subjected by subjection. The apt is apt by aptitude. A chimera is nothing by nothingness. Someone blind is blind by blindness. A body is mobile by mobility, and so on for other innumerable cases. What a crazy ontology. And this is nothing but to multiply beings according to the multiplicity of terms, which, however, is erroneous and leads far away from the truth, says Occam. Here, Occam explicitly claims also that this is the root of the errors of the moderns, meaning contemporary Scotists. Thus, Occam introduced his nominalist logic, basically trying to show just how much metaphysics and theology he can do with how little ontology. That is the idea of Occam's nominalism in a nutshell. Now, Occam's project was largely successful, especially due to the deliberately calm, non-ideological, non-theological efforts of the Parisian arts master John Buridan, who managed to turn Occam's radical innovations into apparently harmless textbook material for a simplified effort to teach logic, physics, and metaphysics. However, in theology, many of Occam's solutions point to an ever-growing divergence between secular and theological discourse. For instance, in order to accommodate the theology of the hypostatic union of divine and human natures in the person of Christ, he provides a disjunctive nominal definition of man, one disjunct applying to Christ and the other to the rest of us. So where is the unity of the species? Thus, even if Occam is not a religious heretic, and this is a quote from the paper that is linked at the bottom of this passage. This is the conclusion of that paper on Occam's theology and his nominalism. Even if Occam is not the religious heretic, philosophical skeptic, or general destroyer of the scholastic synthesis that later most of the Catholic critics of his nominalism tend to depict him as, There is something in Occam's nominalism that, viewed from the perspective of later developments, definitely points in the direction of these developments. In particular, Occam's nominalism points in the direction of the modern separation of religious, theological, and secular, philosophical, and scientific discourse, the synthesis of which was one of the most important achievements of the great metaphysical theological systems of the 13th century, especially of the system of Thomas Aquinas. So this leads us to the question, do we want to reclaim the lost unity of secular and religious discourse to overcome the schizophrenic state of the modern mind? If your answer is no, then you can safely return to ordinary problem-solving manufacturers of analytical journals, or to the quasi-poetry of postmodern continental philosophy, theology, whatever. That is one possible choice. On the other hand, if your answer is yes, then you can start by reclaiming the scholastics' partly lost metaphysics based on their partly lost logic, which is nowadays actually becoming a cool enterprise anyway, with the return of hylomorphism in contemporary metaphysics and the needs of natural language processing in artificial intelligence research. So if you say yes, then you can start that work in this class. Thank you very much for your attention.